Hi, good evening. My name's Joe Williams. I'm the Interim Associate University Librarian for Collections and Services, and let me welcome you first to the University Libraries. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program. And as many of you know, libraries today are not just about books on shelves. We're places where people learn new skills, and they seek and build communities. They share and connect with new ideas, and they create new knowledge. And library staff work with scholars and researchers to use information in new ways and in new formats. And we provide the skills and the tools that are necessary to learn not just how to seek new information, but how to create and disseminate it as well. So I'm very excited about tonight's program, which is about sharing and communicating research in a non-boring way, because it ties into some big initiatives on our campus right now. For one, the Chancellor's Blueprint for Next, with its first principle of the public for the public, and our role to share our expertise with the state and beyond. It also ties into UNC's Quality Enhancement Plan, which I'm sure you're all aware of, with the goal of creating scientists and learning by connecting, doing, and making. And but finally, it ties in with the library's own strategic plan, which is one goal is to support you through every step of the research process. And that includes sharing and communicating your findings to the world. So welcome to our program. And let me now welcome Suchi Mohanty, who is the head of the R.B. House Library, to introduce tonight's special speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I want to thank you all for coming. In the vein of not being boring, I'm going to make a few quick announcements. For anyone coming in late, there are still seats up here in the front half of the room, so be brave and come forward. And if you're sitting in the back, let latecomers know they can sit up here. I really want to thank my colleagues in the library who helped pull together this event. Without you, it would not have been possible. Special thanks to Aaliyah Howell, right in the front. She created that fantastic poster, which might have caught your eye. And a big thanks to my colleagues in the undergraduate library for pulling the reception together and some of the other logistics. How many of you all are students? Okay. How many of you have activated your subscription to the New York Times through the library? Some of you. Okay, so there's a big difference in hands there. On your way out, please take one of the cards from the back table or out in the lobby. The library does provide all currently enrolled students with access to the New York Times website and the mobile app, and that's full access minus the fancy crosswords. So please do sign up for that. You'll have access while you're a student. So it's now my pleasure, try not to be boring, to introduce our speaker, JoAnna Klein. JoAnna is an independent science journalist and a regular contributor to the New York Times Science Desk, where she was brought on to help develop and write for Trilobites, the permanent result of an experiment in visual short-form storytelling. JoAnna also writes and researches virtual reality stories for the New York Times Daily 360. In her previous life, she published academic papers on learning and memory in rats in the world-renowned lab of Joseph Ledoux. Did I pronounce that correctly? Okay. She's got her master's in journalism from the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program at NYU, and another in experimental psychology from App State. For JoAnna, the best stories are those that surprise. She approaches science by embracing its uncertainty, mining for wacky details, celebrating visuals, treating scientists as humans, which they are, recruiting daily life, and being very, very curious. She's a North Carolina girl at heart, but based in Brooklyn now. Her work has appeared in Newsweek, Nautilus, The Scientist, Motherboard, and other places. JoAnna, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
I don't know how I'm going to deal with this mic. Can't hold it. Thanks, Suchi, and thank you, Joe, for the introductions. Let's see if I can manage all of this. If not, I'll yell. Cool. So, hi, everybody. Hello, UNC. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be back here in my home state. I have intentions of hitting up Bojangles at least one time before I leave. Probably only once, because then I'll feel sick. Also, another thing. Oh, I also wanted to mention that it was really weird seeing my photo in the library, but I'm very happy to be here. Another thing I wanted to say is that this is, can y'all hear me? Okay. Is it recording? Do I need to be on here? Okay. I also wanted to be transparent and let you guys know that this is the first talk that I've made as a journalist. All my others were as a scientist. And I think a lot of the scientists were like, this is so weird, like when I gave my talks. So you guys get to be here and watch me do this. So if I'm boring, if I start getting boring, just pretend that I'm not. But this won't be boring. So, without much further ado, let's talk about science and stories. In the summer of 2015, a science writer at the New York Times had just wrapped up an amazing feature story about a scientist who was trying to take the first picture of a black hole. This story was about to go to print. I was an intern, and the Times was going through a change in direction. They brought me in to work on an experimental project called Summer of Science. My job was to bring new audiences to mobile, but it's better described like this. There was a huge party going on online, and everybody was laughing and having so much fun and sharing all their stories on Facebook, and the Times was that guy you didn't really want to get stuck in a room with. He'd start sharing some long bummer of a story about how all the trees were disappearing or something like that, and you'd be wishing you were looking at all the cute dogs over there at BuzzFeed. Don't get me wrong, the Times was smart and full of good stories, some of the best. But he needed to loosen up, and I was there to help him, along with a small team of about 3 other people. This was something the paper hadn't done before. It was our big experiment. We were going to make a kind of fancy Tumblr page with short stories and pretty pictures and GIFs or GIFs, whatever you want to call them, and videos. And our goal was basically just to make science fun, so people would read it and talk about it and share it online. The experiment worked. The rest of the paper used our team's work as examples for how they could be shareable too. And it inspired a permanent column called Trilobites, which I now write for. This is the story of how I did it, and it starts with this black hole. I worked a few days a week and sat in a cubicle beside the photo editor with all the other big editors at the science desk. Each morning, we'd gather and go through a kind of summary of what was going on that day. This particular day was a Friday, and we closed for print on Monday. The big digital editor, my boss's boss, mentioned kind of half-heartedly, oh, it'd be pretty nice if we had some kind of an explainer to go online with this black hole story. I'd prepared a lot before going there, and the first tip of an intern was to always say yes. She hadn't asked a question, but I said yes. I'll do it, is what I actually said. And she said, great. I walked back to my desk and I sat down and I Googled, what is a black hole? And then I panicked. I had just volunteered to create the New York Times version of what is a black hole. I've been working as a neuroscientist for years. I was in school for journalism. This was just my second week as an intern. This wasn't even for Summer of Science. I had no idea what a black hole was, and on top of all that, I had a day to figure it out. A weekend if they were nice. This was going to make or break me, and failure was not okay. I wasn't totally in the dark. My editor told me, write 1,000 words in a list, and she gave me some links to old stories. And Dennis, the guy who wrote the really, really good feature story, brought over some reading material too. Light stuff like A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, who I also Googled, even though I was already well aware that he's a god of physics. So basically, I just take a few hours to understand the universe, and then I'd be done. No big deal. First, I had to know, how were other people describing these things? Not in books, but online, for regular people who didn't really know about space. It was very, very boring, and also not very clear. I called up an astronomer friend of mine for help, but she was kind of confusing too. So then I wrote my lead, and I rewrote my lead, and I rewrote it, and I wrote it again, and on and on. I even went on a date to take a break from it and started telling him what a black hole was. He started mansplaining his ideas about it to me, which were wrong, and I went home and continued. I'm a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan. He's got a particular style of almost talking to his audience, explaining stuff, but not in a condescending way, just very real and very honest. So that's what I did. Once I accepted honesty, the writing was easy because I was explaining it to myself. The same type of person who might wonder, what's a black hole, and then get bored with all the rest of the stuff online. Taking inspiration from him and Stephen Hawking's book, I came up with this. Welcome, Earthlings, to the place of no return, a region in space where the gravitational pull is so strong, not even light can escape it. This is a black hole. Then I say it's okay to feel lost, that Einstein was wrong, and you probably shouldn't be here. For each item on the list, I picked a picture that was either really pretty or blew my mind. And instead of using a short phrase to introduce each item on the list, I wrote a sentence. Each sentence could stand alone, but together they'd tell a short story. The audience could scroll through and pick whatever photo or sentence they liked and look at it that way. It was kind of like a deconstructed feature story. I actually kind of liked it. I turned it in on Monday, and much to my surprise, the editors loved it. It blew up on social media. I knew it was a success when I creeped out Jenny's slate. So, what's the lesson here? First, don't be boring. Not being boring that second week of my internship set the tone for Summer of Science. Not being boring led to trilobites. Not being boring got me to where I am today, writing stories each week that millions of people around the world view and read. From my couch at home with my dog barking at me to take her out, and she's still messing things up, and usually in my pajamas and not showered, but occasionally I get that done. And also, like today, I got it done. Here in front of you all, a little weirded out and worried that I'm going to be boring when you expect me to tell you how to not be boring. So how am I doing? Now's the point in the story where I've shared a little anecdote to grab your attention, and it's time for what we call in journalism the nut graph. I hate this part, but it's important. It's where I ultimately answer a question I ask myself every time I pitch or write a story. Who cares? Whenever I had an idea for my editor, she'd ask me that same question. Who cares? That was code for a few more questions. Why should I listen to you? Why are we talking about this now? What does it matter to anyone? Please, can you give me some context? If I didn't have a good answer for her, the story wouldn't get published. So, why should you even be listening to me? Well, let me tell you. What if I told you that a couple weeks ago I wrote an obituary about a snail named Jeremy? He's got a 1 in a million shell that turns left instead of right. Yeah, I thought it was a bit ridiculous too. But then I learned his story, which was so weird, and I loved it. First of all, Who knew that 1 in 10,000 people are born with their organs flipped like mirror images inside their bodies? Or that Enrique Iglesias is one of them? Or that there was a villain in James Bond who dodged a bullet headed straight for his heart because his heart was actually on the wrong side of his body? I sure didn't. Until I asked a scientist, why should we care about a snail with a freak shell? Jeremy's genetics held the answer to why people and other animals had their own versions of lefty shells. But that's not all. Besides that, Jeremy had the weirdest backstory. He was found in a compost pile, lived in a fridge. He'd become internet famous after a scientist used a hashtag to find him a mate. Turns out, Jeremy's genitals also turned left, which meant he couldn't mate with any righties, which was like every other snail on the planet. Until finally, someone found another lefty snail, and they mated. And then they had babies just before Jeremy died. So now, there's this whole legacy of lefty snails that hold the key to understanding Enrique Iglesias. Maybe. I uncovered these details, and I wrote a story, and I got people to listen to me. And they learned something. And I didn't even have to make anything up or sensationalize a headline. All I had to do was not be afraid to ask questions. So that's one reason you should listen to me. I write about snails. But also, I write about how people can use science in their daily lives, places to experience science, the women sometimes left out of science, conservation. No. This is how science and art intersect, but also conservation and a lot of weird animals. And on the surface, maybe it only matters to some. But taken together, my stories about science show it can be fun. It's more approachable, it's trustworthy, it's useful, and it's something we should care about. That's my job. So why should you care if you can talk about it? Well, you're here, aren't you? How many of you guys are science majors? All right, this is going to work. Okay. So, if you pursue that, or anything else actually for that matter, you're going to start accumulating a bunch of special knowledge. And you can't just keep that for yourself. One day, you're going to have to share that knowledge with others. Because otherwise, what's the point? Sharing your work could mean the classic stuff, like writing academic papers or giving talks. Lord knows those could be less boring. But besides the obvious, it could mean any one of these things up here on this screen that I'm not going to read because that would be boring. But what I want to get across here is that sharing your scientific knowledge is doing your duty as a citizen. And you can't be afraid to step out of your comfortable little bubble. Because science may explain a bubble, but it doesn't exist in one. And also because our world is going insane. Now more than ever, it's important for you to be able to tell stories about science that people will listen to. If I can make a black hole or a weirdo snail something a person can talk about in a bar, if I can get strangers to at least trust that what I'm going to say will be interesting or useful, then I have a platform to talk about other stuff. Then maybe I can change things. Maybe. And maybe you can too. I have hope that we'll all still be here by the time you all graduate, or next year if you're not graduating. At least, and I think it's clear why you should care. At least, I hope it's clear because it took me 2 weeks to write that. So then, how do you do it? How do you talk about science? Well, do you trust me? Look, I've already told you all you need to know. Don't be boring or stutter, and ask yourself, who cares? But we've now arrived somehow at the body of this story, finally. And here's another tip, by the way. Don't make a long intro like I just did, or do it if it feels right, as long as it's not boring. Was that boring? Don't answer that. So, let's get on with how to make science less boring and more fun. Jargon. I'm sure you've all seen papers like this, and if you haven't, you will. This is what I used to study. Nobody wants to read this. It's a lot of words to go a short distance. I was looking at anxiety in rats, okay? I was studying memory, okay? I did different variations of this for 6 years, and it got so monotonous, and I got so good at translating this stuff that I'd sit in a dark room while I trained all those rats and translate stories about science I didn't understand just for fun. Yeah. If I wanted to know why popcorn popped, I'd find a study to translate it. Then I'd connect it with other stuff in pop culture or history or whatever was going on in my life. I guess at that point in time, I was on a popcorn kick or something. Then I'd turn it into a story. I'd write it up on a secret blog for nobody really, which is probably why the most traffic I ever got was from my mom. So the lesson here is simple. Cool it with the jargon. Translation is not enough. Always be curious. Tell a story. And know your audience. Humans is a start, but you can do better. At Summer of Science, we were looking to reach young humans, you and me and all of our friends, and generally people who didn't even know that they cared about science. To grab their attention, we were encouraged to do a few things. Find awesome photos, be creative, use our voice, maintain accuracy, and keep it short. Let's talk about awesome photos. This one's actually kind of sad. This is a photo of a Bengal tiger that was taken during one of the worst heat waves Pakistan had experienced in decades. It was 113 degrees that day. The tiger looks really cute, but he was actually in distress. And his zookeepers had to give him this block of ice so that he could stay cool. When this photo was released in June 2015, the heat killed more than 800 people and sent 8,000 to the hospital. Photos like this can make or break how people engage with a story. Because photos are powerful stuff. They show things we couldn't imagine and immediately grab our attention. They make us feel things. They can be stories in themselves, and they can have endless stories behind them too. I'll write whole features just on pictures that I find in books. And also, we like to share photos because everyone can relate to a photo. Oh, the clicker. Being creative. That's usually pretty easy for me, but maybe it doesn't come naturally to you. And we can all get stuck sometimes. When that happens, you just have to open your eyes. Think about the kind of things that pop up in your daily life that might have some kind of science to them. Talk to people, your friends, your family, your neighbors. Watch TV. I tried looking for stories in X-Files once. And occasionally, I'll get a story from a tweet. My editor sent me this one over the summer because the flower only blooms one time a year, and I write stories about stuff like that. So I scrolled through the thread, trying to see if there was anything cool there, and I got really excited when I saw that people host parties to watch these flowers bloom. That was the story. Not the biology of the flower, but how the biology of the flower brought strangers together. Then I dug. I got so obsessed with this flower that I told my mom about it. She told her friends about it. They all shared it on Facebook. And then I got a weird package in the mail with holes in it that said live plants. My mom sent me clippings of it so I could have my own. The lesson here, besides be creative, is find something you're super interested in, because that will probably show in your story. And then it won't be boring. There's another lesson here too. Always call your mother. Voice. That is a tough one, and I'm really sorry, but I can't help you with that. I don't know how these things develop. Maybe reading, being honest with yourself, practice. I wrote a lot of flowery crap before somebody told me it was crap, and then I cried and I stopped. Maybe that's how you find your voice? And if you don't have one, don't force it. You've got a lot of other things you're good at. Find the one thing that will make your story different. I had to do that with this one. I mean, who cares why leaves change colors? First of all, it's already all over the internet. You can find it anywhere. Why would you go to the Times to read it? All I could think of, and I actually picked this story because it was season. It was the perfect time of year. All I could think of was write it better. So I wrote a poem. And I wove a lesson into it that someone even not interested in science might appreciate. I like sneaking in things that people can use to cope with daily life. They're subtle, and I honestly don't know if anyone notices them. But why not? Around the time the thing in Charlottesville happened, I had to write a story about why onions make us cry. I found it terribly boring, but I approached it like, why we cry can be confusing, but onions are so clear. It helps to appeal to emotions. The final thing that we were advised to do was be accurate, but keep it short. I could tell you what kind of emotions I felt with that challenge. They weren't good. You can do all the other things I mentioned to not be boring, but if your story isn't accurate, you might as well throw it out the window. Let me tell you, it's very hard to tell your whole story in just a minute. It's kind of like a Tinder profile. You have to make a really good impression or they won't swipe right. And then you should probably actually look like your profile pic. What I'm saying is it's really, really hard to distill a full story down to its purest, most fascinating morsel of science. But it's possible. First, you have to ask all the questions so that by the time you're done, you'll be confident you know the story. And also, you'll get a lot of cool details. But then you have to pick out the most important details of that story and keep purifying and purifying and purifying until you're there. And as we know how things often go with science experiments, if you get it wrong, you do it again. I was so bad at this when I first started writing, but my editor helped me. She told me to write these 3 things down at the top of my story. So you guys are getting a little secret. This is a story about X. It is interesting because Y. We learn, answer in 1 line. I did this with so many stories, and I still do it today, but a little different version of it, a little more advanced. But now you guys can try it too. The lesson here is that short stories don't have to be boring, but they do have to be accurate. And it's always nice to have a helping hand to help you get out of a funk. Now, maybe you're thinking, I don't have an editor. Stop it. Look beside you. Any human is a potential editor. You've also got your PI or advisor. And in our Summer of Science experiment, that's basically what our editor was. With her help, the Science Times became that fun, weird, but trustworthy guy you might want to talk to at an online party. I finished the internship. I graduated. I started working at a place where I struggled to write 5 stories a day about stuff like Google's latest email security announcements. So boring. And just as I was questioning my life decisions, my editor called me up. She'd gotten the green light to launch a new column based on Summer of Science. And did I want to help develop and write for it? Yes. But that's my story. A world of only trilobites would get really boring really quick. There are so many other ways to tell a story. There's virtual reality, podcasts, even comics. and classic stuff like books. So, recognize what makes you and your story special and find the way that works for you. And I just toured a bunch of the libraries here today, and you guys have so much stuff that could make you, help you make really, really cool stories. So you're very lucky I didn't have that. And I have one more tip. And if I were an editor, I'd cut it, because this is a fine ending. But I have to tell you this, because it's probably the best advice I ever got, and it's from a UNC alum. Just listen. He was teaching a journalism class I took when I was still working in the lab. Our weekend assignment was to go out and take photos. He gave us a camera, a list of shots, and one piece of advice. Go out and make yourself uncomfortable. Where I was living in Brooklyn, there was this little park, and on Saturdays, this band was always there. They were playing really, really good soul music all the time, and I always walked by and I wanted to go in, but I was too intimidated, so I never did, and I just passed them. But by making myself uncomfortable that weekend, I finally went in. And I learned that the band was the Lafayettes, and they've been playing there for 25 years. And Henry was 15 years, and no, he wasn't. And Henry was 54 years old, and he was the front man. And he had a little dog that he left at home because it was old and not friendly. But it sure would have loved to have met and played with my dog, Penny. Now if I pass by, I wave to Henry. Making myself uncomfortable in that little exercise led to other things. Changing careers, going back to school, writing about black holes, and those led to other things, like standing here in front of you right now with whatever this thing is, puking up whatever that is on this giant screen behind me. Does that make you uncomfortable? Look, don't worry about it. Everyone is uncomfortable. The world is uncomfortable. And science, with its big words and its complex stories and its exploding mystery worms, it's uncomfortable too. And you must know we need it, or you wouldn't be here. So, cheers to you for being interested enough in science to make yourself uncomfortable. Thank you. I'll get rid of this guy now.
Thanks. It was good.
It's a lot.
Up close too. So we have time for questions. So do you want people to just stand up and yell?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Anyone have any?
Hi, I'm Kyle. I'm a graduating senior this year, December actually, and I wanted to write about science for a while, and I enjoy it. And basically, I want to know how you break in. It seems that reading the bios of a lot of my favorite writers, Mary Roach and Sam Keen, some of them tend to have very diverse backgrounds, and there doesn't seem to be a roadmap to actually breaking into science journalism. So I wondered if you could offer one piece of practical advice for aspiring science journalists.
You could sit in a dark room with rats and write about it. Okay. So I started playing around with a blog. If you can get an internship, like if you want to actually like go and get published and stuff, an internship is probably your best, quickest route there, but definitely just start writing.
So I work on the environmental beat sometimes here at TTH and the Daily Journal, and I was just wondering, as a college student, I'm already feeling very overwhelmed and very discouraged often by just the nature of environmental work and environmental reporting. You're often it's an uphill battle. How do you deal with that, and how do you remain optimistic and hopeful throughout?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I don't do a ton of environmental reporting. I would definitely like to do more. I think I don't know, maybe look for the positive stories. There's stuff that's not terrible. Like the Salt Lakes are disappearing. That's no fun. But it turns out that it's not climate change, or at least in one example, it's not climate change, it's human use. So there's something we can do about it. So, I mean, I guess just find like positive stories or ones that might have a solution. Hi.
My name's Betsy and I'm a scientist. You said to keep it short, but maintain accuracy.
It's so hard.
To me, my science is full of grays. Very little is black and white. And if I say something's black, I'm leaving all the white out. If I say something's white, I'm leaving that out. There's very this. How do you maintain accuracy? How do you craft that message without talking and talking?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's particular to the Summer of Science. Those were 350 words, and we've grown a bit to 600, but that's still pretty short. I'm trying to think, like, if I were in your shoes, because what I do is I ask the scientists that I talk to tons of questions, and then questions that I think are stupid. Like, I'm like, this sounds dumb, but I have to ask you because I don't understand. So I guess maybe if you're talking to a journalist, I wouldn't be discouraged if they ask you the most mundane questions. And also keep explaining it, I guess, until they get it. So sometimes I'll say, okay, the way I understood it was this. Is that right? And they'll tell me yes or no. And if it's wrong, then I ask them again and again and again. And another thing is if you can come up with like a good metaphor, that helps a ton. And every once in a while I get a scientist that gives me a really good metaphor and then I'll use it. And then sometimes I'll have metaphors that, like the mixed metaphor situation where you're like, all right, well, maybe I can use some of this. So that helps, I think. Also, you could write a book. Yeah.
Okay, there's two questions I have because I work with students on campus who are scientists about better storytelling, better presenting. And so two things come up. First of all, if you go this direction, will people who are other scientists think that I am things down, not terribly, that I'm taking away? So that's one thing you hear. And then the other thing is, if you are a scientist, you're not going to be a scientist journalist, but you're a scientist. How do you work with journalists to get interesting stories out about what you do so that people will pay attention to something that really is important and understand it rather than dismiss it and be skeptical?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the first question was...
being afraid of looking like you're...
Right.
I don't know, if you use social media somehow, you're not very serious or very professional, or if you write a story for the public that's comfortable, you're not serious, you're not very professional.
Yeah. When I worked in the lab, I convinced my PI that we needed social media. So, but I do know that others, I feel your pain. Others may not take it as seriously. I don't know what to tell you other than you're dumbing it down is like such a terrible way to say it. You don't have to dumb it down, and you should never dumb it down, because then that'll just get blown out of proportion as well if it does end up in the media. I guess do your best to explain it. And then if you're trying to get your ideas to the media, when scientists send me ideas, or when I get a press release from a university or something, I look at, have we covered it recently? I look at, who cares? So how would that affect my readers? And why is it important? I look at its context within the rest of the field. So what are other scientists saying about it, and what does it have to do with society right now? So I think if you can make all of those connections, that would be very helpful.
Thank you. So do a lot of writers in your field have science degrees? Like, do a lot of your colleagues have science degrees? Or like, I think you briefly mentioned something about like a wide variety of backgrounds that come from it. So like, do you need to have a degree in science to do a job like you're doing?
That's a good question. I don't think that you have to. I think it helps me to understand how to talk to scientists, to know just sort of like the science as a society, or as a social enterprise. The people who were in my grad program, most of them had an undergrad in science. And I don't think so. I think if you ask a ton of questions, it might even help. My editor for Summer of Science, she didn't write about science, and she helps me make the most fun stories because then we're that audience that doesn't care about science. And honestly, I hated science. So, I mean, I have experience in it, so it helps me know how things roll. But I don't know. I'm going on and on about it, really.
Hi. My name is Abby. I am a senior environmental science teacher, and I've been interested in journalism for a while. And I'm curious what you do when you get writer's block, or when something is so boring that you've tried your best and you just can't find the spark in it.
If something is that boring, I wouldn't write about it. But if I get writer's block, the thing I said about like talking to people actually really helps. Stop for a second and go out and hang out with your friends. And I mean, don't force it. Don't like make them listen to you, but maybe mention like, oh, I'm talking about this. And then maybe you guys will end up having a conversation where you're like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And that helps a lot. Just like get out of your own head, I think.
I think for a lot of people, they think of science journalism and might think of like the kind of clickbaity or the sensationalized thing on the morning news, like this study says if you have a glass of red wine, you're going to be excellent at everything.
Mm-hmm.
What's your opinion of this kind of like junk or fake science journalism, and what's the best way for scientists and journalists to kind of combat that sort of, piecemeal story?
That's a good question. I'd say it's a product of the internet and this idea that we all have to have whatever we want right then and like the quick instant gratification. So a lot of those stories, like the place I mentioned where I was writing about like Google, I didn't have time. It was bothering me because I didn't have the time to call up scientists or to like double check everything. And they had like each person writing like 5 stories a day. So like those things get out, and then other people, they read those stories and then base their stuff off that. So, I mean, the only solution, at least for a journalist, is get really lucky and find a place that gives you time to fact check everything. Because I've fact check everything. As a scientist, I don't know. There's a lot of like some scientists will use like catchphrases. Maybe that's a good thing because it makes me not trust it. And then I double check it with like a bunch of other people. I don't know. I guess you got to be careful who you're talking to. And I don't know. There's always going to be stuff that maybe it's good to educate people about like how to identify fake news. I don't know. Big problem. Hi. I'm sorry.
My name is Emily. I'm an environmental science major in an aspiring high school teacher. And I was wondering if you had any advice for teachers who are really restricted by food accepting time, all sorts of other laws in their science.
I don't know much about that, but I do know that the Times has a learning section. And I know that they're using trilobites teachers are using trilobites to teach their kids about science. And so somebody actually writes for them lesson plans that connect to the stories. That's really all I know about that. Maybe it would help.
On that subject, I know that with the learning connect class and community sciences, the room called Siren, and they do the same thing. They write lesson plans based on what the graduate students are doing, faculty members, and geared towards different grade levels.
Yeah, I almost wrote for it.
Do you want to say anything about timesandeducation.com?
Oh, okay. Suchi's telling me that it's called timesandeducation.com.
I think that's what it is.
And I think if you Google trilobites for teaching, somewhere a story pops up, and then it gives examples of all of that.
My name is Erica. I'm a graduate student in environmental sciences and engineering.
And you said something earlier about treating scientists as humans, I think.
I might have misremembered.
Maybe I said something like that. Or...
I read it.
Oh. Well, I mean, it's still a thing. I don't know. I think scientists seem very intimidating, right? If you're not familiar with the world. And then, I mean, I think I didn't really understand that until I became one. And I was working with a whole bunch of scientists, and I was like, oh, we can go have fun. We don't have to talk about science all the time. So, yeah, maybe that. And then I guess if I'm talking to scientists, I don't know. I don't know. I think that was in the introduction. But I guess it's just talking to them like they're just like anyone else. I guess if you're a journalist or something, not being intimidated by a scientist and trying to be get everybody on the same level where you can just speak more freely and just be like, hey, I don't know what, I can't think of a jargon word right now. I don't know what that means, and go from there. I don't know. Does that help at all? Okay.
Hi, my name is Sophie Madrova. I'm a first-year quantitative biology student. And so I was sitting here kind of wowed by your presentation to your career, and I was thinking to myself, what do I want to ask you? Something heavy, what is it like working in a crossover between two male-dominated fields, journalism? Okay, you know what? That's heavy stuff. But what I really want to know is, why is your column called Trilobite? There's so many other things you could call it. So I figured I'd go with the basic question.
I like that question. Yeah. Before it was when my boss called me up, there wasn't a name for it, and she was like, "Do you have any ideas for names?" And we were all thinking of different stuff, and we were like, "All right, they're little nuggets of cool stuff, really tiny little things." And I was like, "Oh, a curio, those things you have on your wall that you put all the little knickknacks and stuff in." So that's what I wanted, curios, but then it was too close to curiosity, which was a little cliche. And let's see. One time I was like, oh, donuts, which makes no sense. And my editor wanted to call it the quasi semi hemi demi quasar. I don't. It's super long name for like the shortest note, but it only works for like music, like sound. So that didn't work. And then we ended with I don't know how it ended up being trilobites. They're small. There are a lot of trilobites. Yeah, I think it's just that they're like small things like that you can unearth and find. Like they're cute. I have a trilobite necklace that I didn't wear.
So hi, I'm Carly. I'm a PhD student in the geography department, but I study climate using like really complicated mechanisms. It's useful to hear like some of these ways of expressing things in simpler terms. But my main question, you talked about kind of the difference between what like a scientific conference presentation might look like versus the kind of writing that you do now. What are some ways of incorporating those writing strategies into making like a better presentation at a conference that's still going to be taken seriously?
That's a very good question. One thing that really helps is not having a bunch of text on your screen. That's always 100% more interesting. Oh, this one is fine for scientists to use. Like mine were weird. I had like sound effects. But one thing that I always enjoyed when I'd sit in on scientific talks was when they'd tell like a story from history. So like I don't know, just some obscure thing that no one knows about, but you do because you read it in your like thesis work. So like a story that connects it to the past, or even some kind of story that connects it to a current event. And I think that not only like people will still take you seriously because you'll present your work, but they'll also be like, wow, this is like more important than I even thought. Okay.
One last thing. This is an easy fun one. When you're not writing science stories, where do you like to read science stories? Like, what other places do you like?
Good question. I write so much of it. Undark is a really cool outlet. It's called Undark Magazine. Washington Post is pretty good. I'm not on staff. I can say that. I mean, there's like good writers. Ed Yong is good. Of course, Carl Zimmer. Mary Roach. I don't know. You know, I am working too much. Yeah. All right. Anyone else?
So how long does it take to create one of the trilobite stories?
I guess it depends on when I start the interview and how many interviews I do. So I'll do like an interview and talk for generally an hour. I mean, they vary depending on how complex the story is. So like a hour interview with a scientist, and then if he says something where I'm like, I don't know. Often if he's like, no one believes me, then I have to, and I hear that a bunch of times, or they're like, this was a controversy back in the day, or like they'll say something that just like tips me off, and those are the hardest because I have to figure out, all right, is he just an underdog and no one believes him, and like that's a cool story and it's something like that's not fair in science, or is he not quite? I don't know. So then I have to interview other people. I don't know. Maybe so if my goal is to do an interview the day before and then write the story that day, and then the editor either edits it that day or the next, and then we do a little back and forth. That's the best. So like 3 days. I'm not amazing at time management.
How do you find stories to write
Well, I watch TV. I talk to friends. Sometimes my editor sends me stuff. I look at press releases. Check out what's going on Twitter. I scour the internet for strange things that only happen once a year and things like that. Another cool way to find a story is actually, you could probably find a bunch in mine. If you read a short story or you read a story and there's just one line and you're like, like, I wonder about that, is you can just write another story that's based on that one thing that you didn't hear enough of.
Do you have a different strategy when you think your audience is very pessimistic about your topic? I think, for example, when you're dealing with climate change or like when you want to write about those sensitive topics in so like you have split views of the audience. Do you have a special strategy to that like people who are more pessimistic will kind of not possible for
How to write climate stories for climate deniers? Wow. I think we're all wondering how to make that work. Honestly, I don't know. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and honestly, what I think is get people involved in your stories that it's actually affecting, that are that audience, and put it into an outlet that they'll care about. So like if I were trying to get, I'm obsessed with ginseng. And there are like ginseng diggers in the mountains, and I'm pretty, like, I've talked to them. They don't buy a bunch of that stuff. So if I were trying to reach them, I've been thinking like, oh, I would just use like YouTube or something. But then a lot of them don't even have the internet. So I don't know. Flyers? I don't know. But yeah, I think just making it more human. I think we're out of time. I'm sorry. Should I answer one more? Okay, I'll take one more.
So my question is, how do you approach a story which is already covered in some other outlets or maybe a press release or something?
How do you what?
How do you approach a story? Like if you want to write about something.
Oh. Yeah. All that stuff I was telling you, like look for some way to make it different. If I talk to scientists, they're going to tell me something that is not in the other stories, because honestly, a lot of other stories are I don't want to actually make any claims about other people's reporting, but I think a lot of stories are just based off of press releases. So an easy way to do it is just talk to scientists and ask them you could blatantly say what has not been covered in the media that you think is important, or what has been covered in the media that you think is not right, or stuff like that.
Thank you so much for coming. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I did not think that was boring. I thought that was awesome. So thank you for spending the hour with us, and thank you all for coming.